The North Atlantic was made of iron that week. Wind flayed the water into sheets of silver, and the sky hung low, bruised, heavy, endless. Somewhere in that shifting wilderness, a shadow moved against the storm. Steel, alive and angry. She was called Bismarck. 50,000 tons of German ambition, 8 15-inch guns, armor thicker than a man was tall. She was not merely a battleship, she was an idea. The proof that even after 2 decades of humiliation, Germany could still build something the world must fear. It was May 1941. The war in Europe was young, still balanced between arrogance and uncertainty. Britain stood alone, her empire stretched thin across the oceans. But in the cold grey of the Atlantic, the sea was still her fortress. If the convoy stopped, she would starve, and the Bismarck had been built to make her starve. At dawn on May 19th, the monster stirred. Tugboats eased her out of the fjord at Gotenhafen, her engines rumbling like distant thunder. Seagulls scattered from her wake, frightened by a sound deeper than nature. On her bridge, Admiral Gunther Lütjens stood with his hands behind his back, watching the grey shoreline of occupied Poland fade into mist. He did not smile. He was a man who understood that glory was another name for death. Beside her sailed the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, sleek and modern, a sword to Bismarck's hammer. Together they formed the vanguard of Operation Rheinübung, the mission to break into the Atlantic, hunt British convoys, and bleed the empire from its arteries. Lütjens knew the risks. He also knew that Berlin expected miracles. As the ships cleared the Baltic and turned north, the weather worsened. Waves rose higher than houses, and fog clung to the decks like a living thing. But to the men aboard, the storm felt like protection, their steel giant moving under cover of chaos. The Atlantic, it seemed, was on their side. In London, it was a different kind of storm. Inside the Admiralty War Room, a cluster of red lights flickered on the North Atlantic chart. Each one marked a sighting, a rumour, a ghost. Then a coded message arrived from a Norwegian observer. 2 large warships heading north through the Kattegat. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, stared at the map. The name Bismarck hung over the room like a curse. He had seen what she could do on paper, faster than most cruisers, armed like a fortress, protected like a mountain. He knew what Churchill would say, even before the call came through. From the Prime Minister's line came the voice, rough with fatigue and fury. "Find her, John, find her and sink her." At Scapa Flow, engines roared to life. The old giants, HMS Hood, Prince of Wales, Suffolk, Norfolk, raised anchor and pushed into the open sea. Their crews knew what hunted them, the most feared ship afloat. But fear, like duty, could be turned into fuel. Out on the grey horizon, Bismarck's lookouts watched the water stream off her bow, a white arrow cutting through the iron sea. Her captain, Ernst Lindemann, paced the bridge. He was younger than Lütjens, less political, more visceral. A sailor first, an officer second. He loved his ship like a creature. He would later say, "She moves as if she feels the sea." For now, she was invisible, a ghost with guns, threading the straits between Norway and Greenland. Each wave that struck her hull sounded like a drumbeat of fate. Each mile westward brought her closer to legend. Below deck, the crew worked in silence. Men oiled the breech of the main guns, checked torpedo nets, calibrated rangefinders that could see through rain. They moved with the precision of ritual. Even in their exhaustion, they knew what they were part of. The beginning of something vast, perhaps the end of something else. At 2200 hours on May 23rd, radar screens aboard the British cruiser Suffolk flickered to life. A faint contact appeared. Enormous, fast, moving west through the fog. The operator called out, his voice cracking. "Large ship bearing 240, speed 28 knots. The room went still. A single word passed down the line to every British ship in the North Atlantic. Bismarck. And so the ocean that had hidden her now betrayed her. The chase began. 2 empires, 1 ship, and a sea that belonged to neither. The North Atlantic was vast enough to swallow nations, yet in May 1941 it felt suddenly small. Invisible lines of radio, radar, and rumour stitched the waves together into one trembling web, and at the centre of that web moved a single pulse of steel, Bismarck. At dawn on May 24th, she was running southwest through the Denmark Strait, waves breaking white against her prow. Her escort, the cruiser Prince Eugen, cut a graceful line beside her, 2 predators slipping through storm. The wind was a gale, the sky a bruise, and the ocean rose like muscle under them. To men who had never seen her, she was myth. To those aboard, she was momentum. In the British Admiralty War Room, the map of the Atlantic no longer looked like geography. It looked like a heartbeat. Each red pin was a ship. Hood, Prince of Wales, Suffolk, Norfolk, Ark Royal. Each line drawn in pencil was a guess, a prayer, a measure of fear. Admiral Tovey leaned over the chart, eyes hollow from nights without sleep. He knew his fleet was stretched thin. He also knew there was no choice. If she breaks into the Atlantic, he said quietly, she'll be a wolf among sheep. Across the ocean, convoys crept eastward, cargo ships packed with the lifeblood of Britain, food, oil, ammunition. Men aboard those slow freighters did not know her name, but they felt her presence. The wireless carried rumours of a German battleship loose in the fog, a monster with guns that could reach beyond the horizon. Every creak of hull, every wave that slapped the bow, sounded like a warning. Back on Bismarck, the mood was taut. In the plotting room, red lights glowed on faces bent over navigation charts. Admiral Lutyens stood near the voice tube, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the rhythm of the engines. He knew the Royal Navy was hunting them. He also knew they had to break free into the Atlantic before dawn's light made them visible from the air. "Speed 28 knots, he ordered. We will outpace their eyes. Captain Lindemann disagreed quietly. He wanted to engage, to test his ship's strength. He trusted her armour, her gunnery, her perfect balance. But Lutyens was an officer of strategy, not instinct. "We were not sent to duel," he said. "We were sent to disappear." Disappearance, however, was no longer possible. At 19:22 the night before, radar aboard Suffolk had caught their reflection, a whisper of steel in the mist. Now, both Suffolk and Norfolk trailed at the edge of visibility, keeping contact like wolves shadowing a bear. Radio messages flared across the Atlantic. Enemy in sight, course southwest, speed 28. The hunt was no longer rumour. It was geometry. On the HMS Hood, the crew prepared for action. The oldest and proudest battlecruiser in the Royal Navy, the mighty Hood, had not fired her guns in anger for decades. Men scrubbed decks, checked magazines, loaded the great shells by hand. They were aware of the irony. Britain's symbol of sea power sailing to confront Germany's. 2 empires mirrored in steel, both built on pride. On Hood's bridge, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland studied the grey horizon. He knew he was outgunned. He also knew that morale demanded a confrontation. "We'll engage at first light," he told his staff. "If we find her, we finish her." The sea agreed. That night, the weather cleared for the first time in days. Stars appeared, sharp, cold, infinite, as if the universe itself wanted to witness what was coming. Waves levelled, wind softened, and a pale light crept along the edge of the world. Far to the north, Bismarck's lookouts peered through binoculars rimmed with frost. A sailor on her foredeck thought he saw a glint in the distance, a reflection that didn't move like a wave. He reported it to the bridge. Within minutes, the call echoed down every corridor. "Enemy ship sighted, bearing 270 degrees. In London, Churchill's voice thundered through the war cabinet. "The Hood is engaging. God help her and God damn the Bismarck." The ocean was now a cage, and both beasts were inside it. There was nowhere left to run, no room left for reason. The Royal Navy's oldest pride and Germany's newest monster would meet in the narrow strait between Greenland and Iceland, a corridor of ice, fog, and destiny. By the time the first shells were loaded, the sun had barely risen. The sky glowed faintly, the waves gleamed like molten steel, and the distance between the two forces had shrunk to visibility. Men on both sides could now see the silhouettes, black against grey, of what they were about to destroy. The Atlantic had become very small indeed. The dawn of May 24, 1941, came quietly, too quietly for the violence it carried. The sea was calm, the wind low, the light thin and cold as glass. In that brittle silence, two fleets sighted each other across the grey emptiness of the Denmark Strait. It was 05:52 when the first British lookout cried, "Enemy in sight!" Aboard HMS Hood, 1,415 men stirred to life. Watertight doors slammed shut. Gunnery crews sprinted to their turrets, the smell of oil and metal thick in their throats. On the bridge, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland stood straight-backed, his binoculars raised, eyes narrowing against the glare. Ahead of him, two German ships cut through the mist. Bismarck and Prince Eugen, black silhouettes rimmed in frost and fire. On Bismarck's bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann peered back through his own glasses. He recognized Hood instantly, the Royal Navy's pride, symbol of a century of sea power. To him, this was not just an encounter, it was history demanding a duel. He turned to Admiral Lütjens. "Permission to open fire, sir?" Lütjens hesitated, bound by orders not to provoke unless fired upon. Lindemann's jaw tightened. "I will not let them shoot first," he said. At 05:55, Hood fired her first salvo. A sound like the cracking of the earth itself rolled across the water. The shells arced high, vanishing into the clouds. Seconds later they fell short, geysers of white water rising ahead of Bismarck's bow. The duel had begun. Lütjens turned to Lindemann. "You may return fire," and the monster awoke. 8 15-inch guns roared in unison, each blast flattening the waves for hundreds of yards. The shockwave hit like a physical force. Plates rattled, teeth shook. The first salvo straddled Hood, the second found her range. From miles away, sailors on Prince of Wales could see the orange blooms of impact crawling up Hood's hull. The distance closed to 12 miles. Shells crisscrossed the grey sky like meteors, their trails glowing faintly against the low clouds. Inside Hood, the noise was beyond comprehension, a continuous scream of steel and pressure. Men worked by instinct alone, feeding shells to guns, shouting orders that vanished into thunder. At 0600 exactly, the two British ships turned slightly to open their broadsides. That movement exposed Hood's most vulnerable point, her thin deck armour. At that instant, Bismarck's fifth salvo struck. One shell pierced through the upper decks, slicing past machinery and bulkheads, and fell into the magazine that held the main gun charges. The world turned white. From Prince of Wales, observers saw Hood's midsection erupt in a column of flame 300 feet high. A heartbeat later, the entire ship disintegrated. The sound reached them seconds after the sight, a deep, rolling concussion that seemed to tear the sky apart. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but wreckage and fire on the surface of the sea. The pride of the Royal Navy was gone in 8 minutes. Out of 1,418 souls aboard, only 3 would survive. They clung to floating debris in shock, their faces lit by burning oil. One of them, signalman Ted Briggs later said, "She just wasn't there anymore. One second she was, the next she was gone." On Prince of Wales, sailors stood frozen, staring at the place where their flagship had been. Some whispered prayers, others simply kept loading their guns, rage blinding their fear. The battle continued, but every man knew something irreversible had happened. The sea had just swallowed a century of British dominance. Aboard Bismarck, the crew cheered briefly, then fell silent. Even victory felt heavy. Lutyens turned to Lindemann. The battle is won. Lindemann did not answer. He was staring at the distant fires, the vanishing wreckage, the thin line of smoke that marked the death of a legend. He said quietly, almost to himself, "I wish we hadn't had to do that." Far away in London, the news arrived by radio. A coded message, stark and cold. Hood blown up, sunk in action against Bismarck. In the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill lowered his head. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze and spoke the words that would seal Bismarck's fate. "Sink the Bismarck." From that moment, it was no longer a hunt. It was vengeance. Every ship, every aircraft, every soul in the Royal Navy would converge upon a single target. The greatest warship in Europe had just signed her own death warrant. And somewhere in the cold fog of the Denmark Strait, the monster turned south, her hull scarred, her decks streaked with the soot of triumph, unaware that the ocean itself was about to turn against her. For a moment, after the Hood vanished, there was only silence. Then the radios began to scream. Across the North Atlantic, in every ship, submarine and airfield under the Union Jack, a single message pulsed through the static. "Sink the Bismarck." It was not an order, it was a sentence. In London, the War Cabinet stood around the plotting table, a map of the Atlantic covered in moving pins and threads of string. Churchill paced like a restless lion. His cigar burned low, forgotten between his fingers. "The Bismarck must not reach the open sea," he said. "If she does, she'll slaughter the convoys. The whole island could starve." Around him, the room vibrated with controlled panic. Every voice on the transatlantic line, every admiral, every squadron leader spoke the same oath: find her. The loss of the Hood was more than a tactical blow. It was a wound to the nation's soul. The Royal Navy had built its myth on being invincible, and now that myth was bleeding out into the grey Atlantic. And so the greatest sea hunt in history began. From Scapa Flow, King George V and Victorious steamed south. From Gibraltar, Force H, Ark Royal, Renown, Sheffield, turned north at full speed. Destroyers and cruisers swept in from every corner of the compass, combing through fog and storm like hounds on a scent. Even American patrol planes, not yet at war, were ordered to report any glimpse of the German Leviathan. The sea, that vast indifferent kingdom, had become a net of vengeance. Aboard the Bismarck, the mood was uneasy. Victory had tasted like ash. The celebration after the destruction of the Hood had lasted only minutes before discipline reasserted itself. Men still trembled at what they had seen, a ship exploding like a sunrise and leaving behind nothing but burning oil. Captain Lindemann walked the decks, inspecting damage. The Bismarck herself was bleeding. One of Prince of Wales's shells had struck below the waterline, puncturing a fuel tank. Oil trailed behind her like a wound. In the plotting room, Admiral Lutyens studied the charts. His plan was clear: break contact, make for occupied France, and reach the safety of Luftwaffe air cover. But the ocean was not cooperating. The waves had risen, the fog had thinned, and the trail of leaking oil gleamed like a beacon under the pale sun. Even the sea seemed to whisper, "They will find you." At 10:30 that morning, a British reconnaissance aircraft from Victorious sighted her, a shadow moving through the whitecaps. Radio crackled with static and triumph. Enemy battleship sighted, engaging with torpedo bombers. That night, in rain and gale, the old Swordfish biplanes launched. Their wings were fabric, their speed barely 90 knots, their pilots soaked through by cold and fear. But they flew straight into the heart of the storm. The ocean below was black glass, broken only by the white scars of waves. Tracer fire from Bismarck's guns arced upward, beautiful, terrible, like fireworks at the end of the world. The first wave of torpedoes missed. The second found her, one striking amidships with a dull, hollow thud. But it did little damage. Bismarck turned south again, slower now, her engines labouring. Her crew worked through the night, sealing compartments, tending to wounded, listening to the endless hum of pursuit on the radio waves. At sea, fatigue turned to fury. On King George V, Admiral Tovey wrote in his log, "The Bismarck must be destroyed, whatever the cost. No other consideration matters." His crew worked without sleep, their eyes bloodshot, hands raw from the salt wind. Every hour, the voice of the Hood survivors replayed in their minds. 3 men from a crew of 1,400. Revenge had become religion. The weather grew worse. Waves climbed higher, fog thickened, radar flickered and died. The Atlantic itself seemed to protect the hunted. In London, Churchill demanded updates every 30 minutes. When told that the Bismarck had vanished into the storm, he growled, "She cannot sink fast enough for me." But she hadn't vanished. Not completely. Every few hours, a faint transmission, a fleeting contact, a patch of oil on the water. Each clue pulled the British ships tighter, like hounds closing the circle. On the morning of May 25th, Lütjens broke radio silence to send a long message to Berlin. "We are pursued by numerous enemy forces. Our position compromised. Fuel low. Proceeding to Saint-Nazaire." The message was intercepted. In a single moment, the hunters knew exactly where to look. The sea, which had once hidden her, now betrayed her with every whisper of Morse code. The net was closing. Above her, clouds like bruises. Below, a trench deeper than mountains. Around her, the soundless intention of a nation sharpening its knives. By the time night fell, the Bismarck was alone, wounded, leaking, limping toward the coast of France. Behind her, unseen but inevitable, the Royal Navy followed in silence, guided by rage and radar. And somewhere in that black water between them, the ghosts of the Hood drifted, waiting. The ocean that night was alive, not with wind or rain, but with sound. Engines hummed, rain hissed against steel, and somewhere beneath the storm, a giant moved toward France, bleeding oil into the grey. Above her, in the black sky, the hunters were already rising. On the deck of HMS Ark Royal, the air was thick with oil and adrenaline. Men worked in the dim red light, folding wings, loading torpedoes, shouting over the wind. The aircraft waiting to fly were fairy swordfish, relics of another age, fabric and wood facing the most powerful battleship ever built. They looked fragile, absurd even. But courage has no symmetry. Commander John "Jock" Moffat stood beside his plane, squinting through the rain. Someone told him the Bismarck had already been hit. He only smiled, quiet and grim. Not enough, not yet. The deck heaved underfoot as the carrier turned into the wind. When the signal lamp flashed launch, Moffat climbed into the cockpit, whispered something only the sea could hear, and the engines screamed to life. One after another, the swordfish lifted into darkness. The carrier vanished behind them. Ahead, only cloud and storm. The ocean rose and fell beneath their wings, like the breath of something sleeping and enormous. Rain struck their goggles in silver lines. Through the radio came fragments of voices, static, laughter, fear disguised as routine. Far below, the Bismarck drove through the storm, her hull shuddering with each wave. The wounded ship was leaving a black trail behind her, oil spreading wide like an open wound. Inside, men worked knee-deep in water, patching ruptures that refused to close. The air reeked of fuel and sweat and dread. Captain Lindemann stood on the bridge, one gloved hand on the chart table. He did not look up when the radar officer shouted, "Aircraft approaching from the west." He simply said, "Sound general quarters." Alarms wailed through steel corridors. Gunners ran, boots splashing, hands raw from the cold. The sea flashed white as searchlights stabbed upward into the rain. Then they saw them, shapes darting low over the waves, so close the spray touched their wings.
If they hit the supply ships
Swordfish.
here, we lose the element of surprise.
The cry echoed across the deck. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, spitting fire into the sky. The air turned to lightning. Tracers drew red arcs through the storm. Explosions stitched across the clouds. But the little biplanes kept coming, flying straight through the fury. Moffat's hands trembled on the stick. Flak burst around him, shrapnel slicing through canvas, the smell of burning cordite filling the open cockpit. He could see the Bismarck now, a mountain of steel, her guns flashing like the heartbeat of a god. Every instinct screamed to climb, to flee, but he held course. "Steady," he murmured. "Steady." At 500 yards, he released his torpedo and pulled hard into the rain. Behind him, the sea rose in a single towering column. When it fell, the Bismarck shuddered. Deep within her hull came the metallic scream of twisted steel. In the steering compartment, men shouted. The rudder had jammed. 12 degrees to port, unmovable. The ship began to turn, slowly, helplessly, in a wide, useless circle. "What is our heading?" Lutyens asked. "Southwest, sir, but she won't steer." The Admiral stared at the compass for a long moment, then said quietly, "Then we are done." The storm broke just before dawn. Far to the east, on the British ships racing through the waves, lookouts saw a strange sight. The mighty Bismarck turning endlessly, her wake curling back upon itself like a wounded beast. The radio reports came in. Target damaged, steering gear disabled. On Ark Royal, the soaked pilots returned to cheers that sounded like disbelief. One mechanic whispered, "Those old kites did it." But on the Bismarck, there was no cheering. Only the hiss of wind through twisted metal and the slow roll of a ship that could no longer choose her course. Divers worked until their lungs froze. Engineers bled over tools that broke in their hands. Nothing could move the rudder. The ocean had taken command. She was still armed, still proud, but she was no longer free, and in the Atlantic that is the same as being doomed. When the long night finally ended, the grey horizon was empty except for rain. Lindemann stood on the bridge, coat soaked, eyes hollow, and said softly to his officers, "Gentlemen, tomorrow we fight to the end." And somewhere out there, beyond the rain and the turning sea, the silhouettes of King George V and Rodney were coming on the horizon. Steady, patient, and merciless. The storm had chosen its side. The sea at dawn was quiet again. But it was not peace. It was exhaustion. The wind had dropped. The clouds hung heavy and still, and the surface of the Atlantic gleamed with a dull, leaden calm that hid the violence beneath. In that suspended moment, the hunters found their prey. At 08:43 on the morning of May 27, 1941, lookouts aboard HMS King George V caught sight of smoke on the horizon,
Here, we lose the
thick,
element of surprise.
black,
Move the
and
subs to grid
motionless.
47.
It was not moving
Confirmed.
east
Moving
or
to grid
west,
47.
only turning slowly, endlessly. The call went up, voices rising through the salt air. "Enemy battleship in sight!" Through binoculars, the gunnery officers saw her clearly now. Bismarck, majestic even in ruin, listing to port, her decks torn open, her wake a spiral of oil. She was still alive. She was waiting. Aboard the German ship, Captain Lindemann stood by the bridge rail, his coat plastered to his shoulders by spray. His officers moved around him in silence, faces grey with fatigue. They had been at battle stations for 36 hours, their hands raw, their eyes hollow. Every bulkhead vibrated with the slow rhythm of the engines turning a rudder that could no longer steer. The ship was still a fortress, her guns still loaded, but her path was circular, destiny written in geometry. Below decks, sailors prayed, some to God, others to the sea. Water leaked through shattered seams, smoke drifted through the air vents, mixing with steam and the faint sweetness of burning oil. The Bismarck was no longer a ship. She was a heartbeat in steel, slowing. At 08:47, Rodney opened fire. The first salvo from her 16-inch guns crossed 12 miles of air in seconds. A sound like the cracking of mountains rolled over the water. Columns of spray rose around the German battleship, white pillars against grey sky. Then King George V joined in, her guns answering with a thunder that seemed to shake the horizon itself. In an instant, the ocean became a mirror of fire. Shells fell in arcs so wide and slow they seemed like gods descending. When they landed, they did not explode as much as a raise. Bismarck returned fire. Her great guns barked one last time, but her rangefinders were shattered, her controls unreliable. The first salvos went wide, plumes of water rising harmlessly hundreds of meters away. Her gunners kept firing, blinded, deafened, guided now only by instinct. The entire superstructure shook under the recoil. Men stumbled, blood running from their ears. One shouted, "We're still hitting back!" No one could hear him over the roar. Shell after shell smashed into her hull. The foremast collapsed. The main turrets jammed. Fire swept through the upper decks, feeding on the paint, the oil, the air itself. Fragments of steel whirled across the bridge like shrapnel from another world. Lutyens was last seen standing near the command table, his cap still on, as the roof collapsed above him. He did not move again. For nearly an hour, the British battleships pounded her from point-blank range. 800 heavy shells, 1,500 smaller rounds, torpedoes from destroyers, all hurled at a single, silent target. Yet she would not go down. Even with her guns silent, her decks burning, she floated, stubborn, immense, defiant.
Moving to grid 4-7.
Every few minutes, another flash of secondary explosions lit the interior, and still her silhouette remained, black against the mist. Aboard King George V, Admiral Tovey watched through binoculars. He could not see men, only flame and wreckage. He lowered the glasses slowly. "Cease fire," he ordered. "Let her die in her own time." At that moment, deep inside the Bismarck, engineering crews opened the scuttling valves. They knew the ship was lost, but they refused to let her fall into enemy hands. Water surged through the lower decks, swallowing rooms, engines, memories. Men who had survived the bombardment now drowned at their posts, their last act of loyalty to the steel that had carried them this far. At 10:40, one final torpedo from Dorsetshire struck amidships. The Bismarck heaved, tilted, and began to roll. For a heartbeat she hung there, one side blazing, the other already submerged. And then she turned over completely. Her bow lifted, her stern rose, and she slipped beneath the Atlantic, leaving only smoke, oil, and silence. The British sailors watched her go. Some cheered, some crossed themselves, others simply stared, unable to believe what they had done. The sea boiled for a while, then went calm again. Nothing remained but a few thousand square feet of burning oil, and the faint hiss of rain falling on metal too hot to cool. Out of more than 2,000 men, only 114 were pulled from the water. The rest went down with her, a city of ghosts, sinking slowly into darkness, deeper than memory. The survivors spoke later of the silence, how even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Admiral Tovey turned away from the wreckage. He had achieved the impossible, avenged the Hood, destroyed the Bismarck, and proven the reach of an empire's will. Yet there was no triumph in him, only weariness. He said softly, "Send to London. The Bismarck is sunk." In Whitehall, Churchill received the message at his desk. He exhaled through smoke and said to no one in particular, "The Hood is avenged." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But she was a brave ship." Far below the surface, in the cold silence of the abyss, the Bismarck settled upright on the seabed. Her decks collapsed inward, her guns pointing forever into the dark. No light reached her there, but the Atlantic remembered. Even now, if you drift deep enough and listen hard enough, you can still hear the faint hum of engines that no longer turn. A sound not of defeat, but of pride too heavy to die. For a while the Atlantic lay empty, grey and immense, as if trying to forget what it had just done. The smoke from the burning oil flattened against the surface and drifted away in slow ribbons. The wind lost its edge. The waves rolled without fury.
If they hit the supply
The
ships
guns
here,
had
we lose
stopped,
the element of surprise.
the engines gone
Move the
quiet,
subs to grid
and the men
4-7.
who still lived found
Confirmed.
themselves
Moving to grid
surrounded by a
4-7.
stillness that felt heavier than noise. The wreck of Bismarck was gone. In her place, there was only an oily slick and fragments of metal, a lifeboat turned upside down, a hatch cover bobbing like driftwood. Between them floated the survivors, faces pale against the cold, eyes blank with shock. They said nothing. Their voices were gone. They clung to anything that would float, waiting for rescue or the slow mercy of the sea. British destroyers moved among them carefully, their propellers turning low to avoid sucking the men under. From the decks came the sound of ropes thrown out, voices calling in English and broken German. A few survivors lifted their arms weakly, others simply let the waves carry them. The sailors on Dorsetshire pulled in as many as they could before the cry went up that a submarine might be near. Engines surged. The rescue was cut short. Dozens still in the water slipped back into the fog, their shapes dissolving into the same grey that had hidden their ship. It was not cruelty, only the arithmetic of war. By noon, the storm had returned. Rain fell again, washing blood and oil from the decks. The British crews stood in silence, watching the waves close over the place where the Bismarck had died. None of them cheered. The victory felt too large, too final. They had avenged the Hood, yes, but the cost was a kind of knowledge they had never asked for. They had seen what power looked like when stripped of meaning. In London, news of the sinking reached the Admiralty. Teletypes clattered, officers shook hands. The Prime Minister allowed himself a brief nod. Yet in the war rooms beneath the city, the air stayed heavy. Everyone understood what it meant. One giant had fallen, but the sea would make more. The Atlantic did not end because a single ship sank. It only grew quieter, waiting. That night, the survivors huddled in blankets aboard Dorsetshire. They could hear the storm thudding against the hull, the groan of metal, the distant thunder of other ships heading home. Some stared at the deck, seeing not wood, but the faces of the men still down there, locked in steel 3 miles below. Others looked out through the portholes, watching the sea rise and fall, endless. None of them slept. Far beneath them, the Bismarck lay on the seabed, upright, dignified even in ruin. The mud around her hull settled slowly, drifting through the silent water like dust in a ruined cathedral. Her great guns, long since cold, still pointed toward the surface. Fish moved through the open hatches, their scales catching the faint glow that filtered down from above. The ship no longer breathed, but she was not gone. The sea had folded her into its memory. Decades later, when explorers found her again, she was almost whole, armor plates intact, swastikas erased by rust, her name barely legible. Cameras panned along her decks, and the light from the submersible made her look as if she were only sleeping.
Move the subs to grid 4-7.
The men watching the screens spoke in
Confirmed. Moving to
whispers,
grid
afraid
4-7.
to wake her. One of them said softly, "She still looks proud." And she did. The ocean forgets many things. The names of ships, the flags they flew, the reasons they fought. But it remembers sound, the concussion of guns, the rhythm of engines, the last cry of men who refused to yield. Those vibrations stay in the water, drifting forever, part of the deep's endless heartbeat. On calm nights, sailors still swear they can feel it beneath their keels, a low pulse, steady and sorrowful, moving through the hull like the memory of thunder. Above, the stars returned, cold and countless, indifferent witnesses to everything. The wind carried no scent of oil now, only salt and rain. The Atlantic had cleaned itself, leaving behind nothing but its own silence. And in that silence, the war went on. The war moved on, as wars always do. But the story of that week in May never left the Atlantic. It lived beneath every convoy that crossed her afterward, a ghost in the waves. Sailors still spoke the name Bismarck in low voices, half respect, half superstition. They said the ocean had claimed her not out of hatred, but balance, one act of pride answered by another. In London, when Churchill read the final report, he did not smile. He understood that victory at sea was always a form of drowning. Every triumph left something human beneath the surface. The Admiralty charts were updated, the pins moved, the briefings continued. Yet each man who had watched the Bismarck die carried a private silence afterward. They had seen the end of an idea, that strength alone could command the sea. In Germany, news of her loss arrived softened by propaganda, wrapped in phrases about honor and duty. But mothers knew the truth when they looked at the telegrams. The photographs of the ship, gleaming, invincible, turned sepia overnight. Pride, once a banner, became a memory they could not hang anywhere. The ocean kept her secrets. Down in the dark, where sunlight is a rumor, the Bismarck settled into the silt with the serenity of a monument. Pressure folded her steel, rust wrote slow poems across her hull, and her decks filled with sand fine as ash. She lay there like a cathedral built for no one, her silence larger than the prayers once whispered on her bridge. Decades later, when the cameras of the deep returned and their lights found her again, it was not victory they illuminated, but humility. The wreck stood upright, her bow still proud, her name half erased. For a moment, the explorers felt as though they were trespassing on a grave too vast to belong to men. They turned off their floodlights and let the dark have her back. From above, the Atlantic looked the same as ever, grey, endless, innocent. But somewhere under that mirror, two ghosts still faced each other, the Hood and the Bismarck, pride against pride, their wrecks forever silent in the same cold kingdom. The sea had accepted them both, impartial and eternal. It is tempting to think of the hunt as a story of revenge, of one empire humbling another. But the deeper truth lies quieter. The ocean does not care for flags or victories. It measures only weight, the weight of steel, the weight of will, the weight of men who believe themselves unsinkable. And in that measure, every ship is the same. For in the end, the sea remembers only silence, and the silence is heavier than pride.